The moment the cake hit me, the entire atrium went silent. Then the laughter erupted, not just from family, but from the senior leadership of Sterling & Sons, from major clients who were attending my father's 70th birthday celebration, from everyone who mattered in my professional world. I stood there, covered in crimson frosting, my custom-tailored suit ruined, expensive cake dripping down the back of my jacket and onto my Italian leather shoes. The smell of buttercream and humiliation filled my nostrils. My 6-year-old nephew Toby was cackling with pride at what he had done. My sister Suzanne, his mother, was covering her mouth, but her eyes, wide with unmistakable satisfaction, told the real story. This wasn't an accident. This was orchestrated, and everyone in the room knew it. My father, the CEO of Sterling & Sons, walked toward me with his face tight with rage. He didn't look at Toby. He didn't acknowledge my sister. He looked directly at me, his voice cutting through the atrium like a blade. "Elias, why do you always ruin the mood? Go clean yourself up. You're an embarrassment." Those were the words. Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "I'm sorry that happened." But, "You're an embarrassment." I was being publicly blamed for being attacked. My hands clenched so tight, I felt the silk lining of my jacket threaten to tear. I looked around the room and saw the familiar expressions. Pity mixed with judgment. People who work with me every day, people who benefited from my work, looked at me as if I deserved this humiliation. I turned and walked toward the executive washroom, my jaw locked so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. I am Elias Sterling, 35 years old, the ghost keeping my family's legendary architecture firm solvent. I stripped off the ruined jacket in the executive washroom and stood under the cold water, trying to process what had just happened. 15 years. 15 years of methodical, painstaking work at Sterling & Sons. 15 years of catching my father's mistakes before they became catastrophes. 15 years of watching my sister Suzanne spend money recklessly while being celebrated for her creative vision. 15 years of watching my brother-in-law Vincent get promoted for his charm while I remained in the background, doing the actual work. And this was how I was treated. As I was cleaning my jacket, my eyes caught something on the floor, something small and dark, partially obscured by discarded paper towels. I picked it up. It was a phone, a burner phone, the kind designed to be untraceable. It was unlocked. I knew immediately it wasn't mine. I knew it didn't belong to any legitimate employee. My analytical mind shifted into overdrive. I opened the phone and found what made my stomach drop. There were text messages, hundreds of them, between two people. The messages were short, coded, professional in tone, but clearly intimate in context. One number was saved as boss, another as lover. But beneath the personal communications, there was something far more damaging. Financial data, bid structures, cost breakdowns, proprietary pricing information for projects we had competed for and lost. Our firm's most confidential information was being systematically forwarded to an encrypted external number. I recognized one of the phone numbers immediately. It was my brother-in-law Vincent's encrypted business line. My hands began to shake as the implications crystallized. Corporate espionage. I spent the next 3 hours with the phone locked in my office, my door closed, my mind racing to the strategic implications of what I had discovered. Vincent wasn't just having an affair. The intimate messages made that clear. He was leaking our bid data to someone with access to our most confidential information, someone who could pull project details that should only be available to senior leadership. I thought about the contracts we had lost over the past 6 months. 6 major projects, any one of which would have brought $50 to $100 million in revenue. We had lost them to competitors who somehow always seemed to know our bidding strategy. We had always wondered how rivals could undercut us so precisely. Now I understood. Someone inside Sterling & Sons was bleeding us dry. And it wasn't just Vincent. This level of access required someone with legitimate authorization to classify financial data. Someone in a position of trust. I thought about Ms. Price, our chief compliance officer. Perfect, polished, always impeccably professional. She had the access. She had the clearance. She had everything needed to extract this information. And Vincent, charming, superficial Vincent, was her partner in this scheme. But I needed proof. Real, irrefutable proof that couldn't be dismissed by my father or explained away by my sister. I needed something so concrete that even my father's bias toward his favorite son-in-law couldn't protect him. I locked the burner phone in my private safe and made a decision. I requested a meeting with Mr. O'Connell, a private digital forensics specialist I had contacted years ago for a separate matter. I didn't explain the personal connection. I simply told him I needed a confidential forensic analysis of a device I had discovered. The extraction needs to be forensically sound. I specified, time-stamped, IP-linked, everything properly documented for potential legal proceedings. Mr. O'Connell understood immediately. He didn't ask questions. He did his work. The results came back a week later in a secure report that was 47 pages long. The evidence was absolutely overwhelming. The text messages weren't just intimate. They were incriminating. There were explicit photos, yes, but more importantly, there were financial discussions. Vincent was receiving payments, substantial payments, payments that had been carefully hidden in shell accounts and untraceable wire transfers. Ms. Price was using her access as chief compliance officer to pull proprietary bid data. Vincent was funneling it to a competitor that happened to be owned by an old friend of my father's who had turned rival after a business dispute years ago. But that wasn't the most damaging discovery. Buried in the forensic data were records of at least a dozen conversations where Vincent specifically discussed his strategy for undermining me. There were messages where he mocked my work, discussed his plan to position himself as indispensable to my father, and, most critically, detailed his intention to eventually blame me for financial losses he was deliberately creating. Vincent wasn't just committing espionage. He was planning to frame me for it. The next phase of my strategy required absolute precision. I went to work the following Monday as if nothing had happened. I played the part of the quiet, competent analyst, the role I had perfected over 15 years. I responded to Vincent's superficial kindness with polite professionalism. I accepted his casual insults with the same resignation I had cultivated. "You okay?" he asked one afternoon, his tone dripping with false concern. "You seemed upset after the cake incident. Look, I brought you a new project file. A big one. You need a win." He handed me a thick digital file, his smile never wavering. I took it with gratitude I didn't feel. That night, I analyzed the file he had given me with the same level of detail. I applied to everything, and I found exactly what I suspected. Embedded deep within complex spreadsheets were 3 catastrophic financial errors. Errors designed to undermine the integrity of the Millbrook Tower project, our firm's most important current development. If I had submitted this file as Vincent intended, the project's financial model would have collapsed. The investors would have walked. The firm would have lost the deal. And Vincent, positioned as my supervisor and mentor, would have been able to claim that I had been the source of the errors. It was a setup, a meticulous, deliberate trap designed to destroy my professional reputation, while simultaneously making my brother-in-law look like he had caught my incompetence. I created a clean version of the file and documented the original in my secure backup system. Over the next 2 weeks, I began the process of building an irrefutable case. I couldn't go through normal channels. If I reported my suspicions to Human Resources or the General Counsel, Vincent and Ms. Price would be alerted. They would destroy evidence. They would align my father against me. Instead, I contacted the lead investment partner on the Millbrook Tower project, a man named Mr. Harrison, who'd been considering this development for 2 years. "Mr. Harrison," I said carefully during a secure call, "I need to meet with you privately. There's security vulnerability in our firm's financial data handling that could impact the Millbrook project." I didn't mention Vincent. I didn't mention Ms. Price. I simply presented evidence of a systematic breach. Mr. Harrison was alarmed enough to contact my father and demand an independent security audit before committing any further funds to the project. This created the perfect pressure point. My father, embarrassed by the insinuation that his firm had security problems, authorized an internal compliance review. He assigned it to Ms. Price, which was exactly what I needed. Now she would have to review evidence of her own crimes without being able to escape scrutiny. I spent 2 weeks compiling everything into a comprehensive report. The report was 60 pages long. It included Section A, the forensic analysis proving the leaked financial data and its connection to contract losses, monetary value, $87 million in lost revenue. Section B, documentation of the shell accounts and hidden payments to Vincent. Section C, detailed timeline showing how Vincent had positioned himself to frame me, including the flawed file he had given me. Section D, analysis proving that Ms. Price's compliance sign-offs correlated directly with each act of espionage. Section E, communication records showing Vincent's explicit plan to blame me for financial disasters. The report was built on legitimate forensic evidence. Everything was documented. Everything was time-stamped. Everything was irrefutable. I printed 3 copies. I didn't submit the report through internal channels. I knew that would give Vincent and Ms. Price time to react. Instead, I made 3 separate deliveries. The first copy went to the General Counsel of Sterling & Sons, Mr. O'Malley, a man I knew to be ethical and independent. I included a cover letter explaining that I had discovered evidence of significant corporate misconduct and was reporting it through proper legal channels. The second copy went directly to the board of directors, sent through a secure attorney I had retained. This ensured that my father couldn't bury the information or protect his favorites. The third copy went to Mr. Harrison at the Millbrook Investment Group. He needed to know that the security issues he had been concerned about were far more serious than infrastructure vulnerabilities. I sent all 3 copies on a Friday afternoon, timed so that no one could immediately contact me to negotiate, threaten, or intimidate me into silence. Then I went home and waited. The explosion happened on Monday morning. Mr. O'Malley called an emergency board meeting. My father was completely blindsided. He called me into his office, his face red with fury. "Elias, do you know what's happening? Someone has accused Vincent and Ms. Price of corporate espionage. This is insane. You need to help me figure out who would do something like this." The irony was so thick I could taste it. "I haven't heard anything," I said calmly, looking confused. "But it sounds serious. Have you contacted your legal team?" My father stared at me for a long moment. I could see the moment when doubt flickered across his face, but he pushed it away. He pushed it away because it was easier to believe a conspiracy than to believe that his favorite daughter's husband, and by extension, his favorite daughter, had betrayed him. Just go back to work," he said finally. "I'll handle this." The board meeting happened that afternoon. I was not invited. I sat at my desk and worked on legitimate projects, maintaining the quiet competence that had always defined my professional life. What I didn't know was that Mr. O'Malley had moved with absolute decisiveness. He had frozen all of Ms. Price's access to the compliance systems. He had called in external investigators to validate the forensic analysis. He had contacted law enforcement. By 4 p.m., police officers were in the building. By 5 p.m., Ms. Price was being escorted from the office by federal agents investigating corporate espionage and fraud. And Vincent, suddenly realizing the enormity of what was happening, panicked. Vincent came in my office just before 6 p.m. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. The charming veneer he had cultivated so carefully had completely cracked. "Elias," he said, and I could hear the desperation in his voice. "What did you tell them?" I looked up from my desk, feigning complete confusion. "Tell who about what?" I asked. "The board, the investigators. Someone gave him a report, someone who knows about Ms. Price and me, someone who knows about the financial data." He was spiraling. He was panicking, and he was about to make a catastrophic mistake. "You know what happened," he continued, his voice dropping. "You know I was accessing the data. You know about Ms. Price. This was you, wasn't it? You couldn't handle that we got promoted instead of you, so you destroyed us both." I just stared at him with an expression of perfect innocence. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said quietly. "You should probably call a lawyer." The police arrested Vincent at 6:45 p.m. Ms. Price had already been taken into custody an hour earlier. Within hours, both had been formally charged with corporate espionage, fraud, and conspiracy. My father stood in the boardroom, his entire world collapsing around him, and finally, someone asked me to come explain what I had discovered. I walked into that room and presented the evidence. Calmly, professionally, without any emotional satisfaction, even though I could have basked in every moment. I showed them the forensic reports. I showed them the financial impact. I showed them the explicit evidence of Vincent's plan to frame me. I showed them everything. Suzanne, sitting at the conference table, began to cry, not from remorse, but from the realization that her comfortable life had just been destroyed. Her husband was facing federal prison time. Her comfortable position in the firm would evaporate. My father looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, recognition. "Elias," he said finally, "why didn't you tell me immediately?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me," I said simply. "You would have believed them. You always believe them." He didn't have an answer. The legal proceedings took 4 months. Both Vincent and Ms. Price pleaded guilty to multiple counts. Vincent received a 3-year federal sentence. Ms. Price received 2 years. Both were ordered to repay the firm the full value of the contracts they had sabotaged. Sterling and Sons recovered $91 million in restitution. The firm's reputation, which had been briefly tarnished by the scandal, was actually strengthened by the story of how internal controls and honest analysis had caught and stopped the corruption. And my father, humbled by how completely his judgment had failed, made a decision. He stepped down as CEO. He recommended that I take the position. The board of directors, having witnessed my competence, my integrity, and my quiet strength, voted unanimously to appoint me as the new chief executive officer of Sterling and Sons. I walked into the firm the morning after my appointment was announced. The same people who had laughed when the cake fell on me, the senior leadership, the major clients, the people who mattered in my professional world, now stood and applauded as I passed. I was no longer the quiet analyst working in the background. I was the strategist who had saved the firm. I was a man whose competence and integrity had triumphed over corruption and greed. I went into my new office, the same one my father had occupied, and sat at the executive desk. On the wall behind it, I hung the original forensic report, not in triumph or vindication, but as a reminder that quiet competence always matters, a reminder that patience has value, a reminder that the people who mock you often don't understand the power of someone who simply keeps working, keeps observing, keeps strategizing. My sister never came back to the firm. She divorced Vincent before his trial was even complete. The last I heard, she had moved to another state and started a new life. Quietly, without fanfare, without the kind of ostentatious display that had once defined her. My father, now retired, occasionally came to the office. He would stop by my desk, and we would discuss firm business. He never explicitly apologized for how he had treated me, but his respect had returned. And in our family, that was the closest thing to an apology that would ever come. 2 years into my tenure as CEO, I stood in front of the firm's entire staff and shared the story of what had happened. I didn't tell it as a revenge narrative. I told it as a lesson about integrity. I told it as a story about how the work we do matters, even when no one is watching, even when we receive no recognition, even when we are mocked and humiliated. I told it because I wanted every person in Sterling and Sons to understand that competence is power, that quiet strength is real strength, that the person who simply shows up and does excellent work day after day will eventually be vindicated. And I told it because I wanted to ensure that what had happened to me, the systematic dismissal, the public humiliation, the corruption enabled by favoritism, would never happen to anyone else in this firm again. Sterling and Sons became known as a place where quiet competence was valued, where analytical thinking was respected, where integrity wasn't just a word in a mission statement. It was a foundation of how we operated. The firm's revenue doubled in my first 3 years as CEO. But more importantly, we became a place where people like me, the quiet analysts, the methodical strategists, the people who work without needing applause, were finally seen. We were finally valued. We were finally home. I stood on the terrace of my office on the 42nd floor, looking out at the city skyline. The memory of that birthday party, the cake, the laughter, the public humiliation, was no longer painful. It had become something different. A marker. A moment when I had the choice to either disappear into shame or to use my competence as a weapon and a shield. I had chosen the latter. And I had won, not through anger, not through vindictiveness, but through the simple, undeniable power of excellent work, strategic thinking, and patience. The woman I would eventually marry, someone I met years later, long after all of this, would sometimes ask me about the scar that this experience had left on me. "Does it still hurt?" she would ask. I would think about that question, and I would always answer the same way. No, it reminds me. It reminds me that the people who dismiss you don't understand your value. It reminds me that quiet strength is the most powerful kind of strength there is. It reminds me that patience and competence will eventually be rewarded, even if it takes longer than you would wish. She would nod, understanding without me having to explain further, and I would return to my work. The work that had always defined me, the work that had always been enough, the work that had ultimately changed everything. Because that's what I learned that day, covered in cake and humiliation, walking to a washroom in my own family's firm. Your worth is not determined by how much they applaud you. Your value is not measured by their recognition. Your strength is not diminished by their mockery. You are enough. Your work is enough. Your competence is enough. And eventually, if you're patient, if you're strategic, if you keep working, the world will finally see what you've always known about yourself. You've always been more than enough. You've always been essential. You've just been waiting for the moment when they finally understood. If you made it this far, you understand, respect is non-negotiable. My worth wasn't defined by my father's public shame or the cake smeared on my suit. My story proves that silence can be a weapon, and patience, the patience to let Vincent and Miss Price expose their own fraud, can be absolute power. If this resonated with you, if a narcissistic family has gaslit you into professional invisibility, tell them this. Your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary. Never let their favoritism eclipse your genius. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. They thought I was an embarrassment. I became the CFO who secured the firm and saw the traitors arrested. Share your story in the comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.